Alright, so this is another one of those ones I've been planning for a while, and have been putting off for the past few weeks, but now that it's, like, a little past and we're into, like, the 4th of July weekend, what better time than to talk about Kevin Costner's baseball movies. I initially was just gonna do, like, maybe Bull Durham and Field of Dreams, but then until you think about just how different those movies are, I figured we might as well just go all in and throw For Love of the Game in there. Even if maybe the qualities of these are very different, but also their approaches to the material are also very different, so it makes sense. They're all kind of coming from their own different place. So I think we might as well go in the order of release, which would start us with Bull Durham, which, to my understanding, is still widely considered not just one of the best baseball movies ever, but one of the more beloved sports movies in general, at least in the circles I hang around in, I guess. Obviously, it's been a while since I updated my copy, but I will do that in time. And I think the main reason for that is this is a movie that obviously isn't something that I took to immediately. Like, it wasn't necessarily a love at first sight thing. And I think a lot of that, like 99% of that, is the fact that I was at a really young age when I saw this movie. I was probably... This is one of the few cases where I'd say I was probably legitimately way too young to see a movie when I did. And not just because you could say it's a dirty movie, sure, but that the sort of understanding that it takes of the material to appreciate a movie like this. Because it comes from Ron Shelton, who was who started to get better known as it went on for his relationship to really the sports movie genre in general. He took some detours here and there, and his career didn't necessarily isn't exactly thriving right now. But he basically became kind of synonymous with the sports movie and kind of the sort of the achievement that most people kind of wanted when they went into one at the time. And I think mainly because of his understanding of the sportsy title, particularly this one, where to my understanding, he had a lot of experience in not just baseball, but the whole minor league area also that the movie covers. So, and you get the sense of that immediately when the movie starts, because we have Susan Sarandon narrating and talking about the Church of Baseball. And just in this, whole opening scene in general, where we see, what's his name, Max, the Clown Prince of Baseball, and just everything and the music, and it's just, really taking in, even if you don't appreciate baseball going into this movie, by the time the opening credits are over, you will. Because I've said in the past that I'm not particularly a sports person, mainly watching them on TV or whatever, but I have been to a number of baseball games in person, and that's a totally different thing. Once again, you don't have to be a sports fanatic to appreciate just that atmosphere. Now there's something to it, sort of like when you watch movies say to go off on an example, when you watch movies like American Graffiti, and it makes you nostalgic for a period that you were probably not even born yet. That kind of gives you that same feeling where it's even if you've never been a sports fan, watching this movie will make you nostalgic for baseball, interestingly enough, just the way it captures the whole thing. And going on this Sarandon character, who's a very interesting character to sort of make the center of it, because it could have really mainly focused on the rivalry between Costner and Tim Robbins, but the kind of making her the center of it and the heart of it, and this character that, you could just, say she's a baseball groupie and that's the end of it, but there's so much to this character that only really shows the surface of, where she kind of operates on this sort of even trade, where she says that by sleeping with somebody on the Durham Bulls each season gives them the confidence and basically makes her feel safe, is the way she puts it. And the way that goes into that, where it's basically her duty to do this. It's her duty to the team to be able to pull this off and take these players that kind of have that somewhat inexperience and put them out there and make them more, get them closer and closer to almost being to where they want to be by the end of this, when they're going to the show, as they call it. So the interesting thing about that also is that the fact that that is basically her duty and that's the way she sees it is shows you just how much everybody in this movie cares about the sport itself. There's nobody in this movie that like doesn't understand baseball to like its absolute fullest. There's nobody that has to be taught baseball in this movie because every character, big or small, knows every single one of its ins and outs. So but there obviously is the counter to that, where while you may know the ins and outs of the sport, there may be people that need more experience, which is where Serena comes in, particularly with Tim Robbins' character. But before we go into that, we do have the introduction of Costner's character, and the interesting thing about this is that, because this was still pretty early in Costner's career, so it wasn't until sort of later that Costner got to be known as like the sort of, relatable, sort of easygoing type character that he would play in Field of Dreams right after this. His character in Field of Dreams is definitely much more the kind of image you associate with Costner. So if you're not completely familiar with Bull Durham, it might be pretty jarring to go back to it and see him as like this really jaded, foul-mouthed character. Like some of his first lines are like, fuck this shit and fuck this fucking game and stuff like that. But it's also got, because he's got the anger in there, but then he's also got it in some of these really articulate ways. His big "I believe" speech. I'm really under the impression this movie got an Oscar nomination in original screenplay for Shelton, and I almost think that the "I believe" speech was like that by itself got it that nomination. While everything else is really well written also, and like especially all the characters in one way or another. But just scenes like that also just really, there's so many scenes in this movie that just kind of stay with you, even if sometimes they might seem like mundane. Stuff like Robert Wall's line about candlesticks make a great gift or whatever is to my understanding, I think I heard him say in an interview, is a line that like still follows him today, and it just feels like just a very one-off line in the moment, and stuff like that really comes through. So but then you've also got this rivalry between the two of them, which is really carefully handled, because in these first moments, and the way Serena basically dismisses it as saying, like, could you stop acting like boys, or whatever it is she says. And that could have kind of played off as this really sort of surface level thing, and this sort of character type kind of thing, which they've already broken with the Serena thing right away. So now they've got to do it with the guy characters as well. And of course, it's up to him to, well, it's up to them working together, really, even though they're coming from opposing sides, to get Nuke to be the best player that he can be. And that's so there's like rivalries everywhere here, which is great, and just everything is bouncing off these three characters in one way or another. But the relationship between him and Costner, you do have these scenes where we are introduced to Nuke, and he's the kind of guy that says, like, he's doing an interview, and he says stuff like radical and tubular, and Costner's just off to the side talking about how this is such a lost cause. But the thing about that is they're also able to make it, there is still something like really clever and funny about the way they do that to his character, where it's like when she name drops Walt Whitman, and his response is, who does he play for? Just kind of in one line says everything about his character. Where it's like, he's not a complete and total buffoon and idiot, but he is just enough that he desperately needs both of their help in one way or another. And the trash talk between the two of them is practically poetic. It's like there's just such rich dialogue in that, where, like I said, it could have just been really easy and throwaway if they had just stuck with like character types and like generic insults and stuff like that. But it also has a lot to do with the actors and their chemistry and the way they deliver the lines. Like there's the obvious stuff like how Costner keeps referring to him as meat, and that's enough to just kind of set him off by itself. Like it's just degrading enough, even if he's not quite sure what it means or why. But it's just derogatory enough that he knows, and that's what upsets him. And then Costner's delivery of stuff like, I heard you couldn't hit water if you fell out of a fucking boat. Talking about like his 5 cent ad, all that stuff. All that, and a lot of that is in that one scene alone where he's telling him to throw the baseball at him. And it's just really right away. And their characters like barely know each other. This is like the setup to what their relationship is going to be, and it just kind of says everything up front. But then also does have some interesting directions to go also in the way they kind of go in and out of that. And like I said, the relationships kind of keep shifting and changing in regards to whose advice he's going to start taking. And then once there's everything going on between Costner and Sarandon, which starts off as like sort of almost like a rivalry thanks to Robbins' presence here in more than one way. But then the interesting thing is that the sexual tension between the two of them basically becomes one of the main stars of the movie. And that's the thing is, this is one of those cases where this movie actually knows what to do with that. Because usually a lot of the time when movies, especially when they're taking a more sort of comedic approach to it, you can tell they're trying to set up the sexual tension thing, but a lot of the times it doesn't work because it seems like they're way in too much of a hurry to get to the payoff. Like, they don't want it to stay tension too long. But this movie just eats that shit up. This movie goes as far as they can with it until we literally get all the way to, like, the last 10 minutes before there's finally a payoff to all that tension between them. And the way the movie handles that, like, the way the movie handles sex in general was making me realize that, and I don't want to take, you know, the whole, like, bitter old man saying, what are movies today and all that, but I mean, really, when you watch a movie like this, and you see it, as where I was talking about before, where, like, it really is a dirty movie, but the thing that's great about that is that the way in which you can say this is a dirty movie, and the way you can say that about a lot of the dirty movies today, is so incredibly different, because lately now, not just nowadays actually, but for a long time now, what you would consider to be like dirty humor is also considered childish, and like the target demographic for a lot of dirty movies now, the target demographic isn't even old enough to see them. But the thing is this actually feels genuinely like a dirty movie that's for an adult audience. Like I was saying, when I saw it at a really young age, like, it just really didn't... Like, at the same time, I felt like I was getting a bit of an education in some senses. But in other senses, I felt like it was just going right by me. Because I just really wasn't kind of mature enough to take it in for what it was. And I think that's something that kind of feels really rare nowadays in comedies that go for that particular humor. And this movie is so smart about it that it's... Yeah, it just really makes you realize just how much of that is missing now. So that's something I'll always appreciate for this also. And then also talking about that's a lot of what the relationship between Costner and Sarandon is. So between the two of them, also you see how they're pretty... Even though the chemistry is like getting better and their characters kind of go in and out of liking each other and hating each other. Mostly hating each other, and when they do like each other, it's not even blatant about it. You just kind of get a sense, like, I think they're starting to like each other, even if neither one of them's going to say it. But also the way we kind of get to physically see how they're opposites. And one of these cases would be their inner and outer monologues, where when Crash is up at bat, he's having, like, this internal monologue where it's, like, voiceover. And that's also the way they use voiceover in kind of two different ways between, we've got Sarandon's, like, regular narration on top of Costner having, like, an inner voice, is really interesting, and how it doesn't feel too muddled. It seems like that'd be a bit odd and weird, but they do manage to make it work, especially if you're comparing his inner monologue to what Nuke is doing, which is he has an outer monologue, where he's having the same monologues with himself that Crash is, but while Crash's are in voiceover, Nuke is just saying his out loud. And I don't know if this is the point, but it's like it feels like really weird and stilted, almost like he's practically spelling out like just the sort of character type that he's being built up as, where he says stuff like, You know, he doesn't know about fun. He's old, and I'm young. And just really stilted dialogue like that. Like, I'm the one driving a Porsche and stuff like that. But I almost think that's the point, because it really shows sort of how much of an opposite he is to Crash in regards to how they talk to themselves. So I think that's really well done. And then I was talking about, we've got our side characters here who are really memorable. Like I said, no matter how big or small their screen time. Robert Wall, obviously, I mentioned. I also love his line about Sears. Or once again, he's like the master. You can see this like throughout Robert Wall's career. He's so like got this hold on just saying one line, and just making comedic gold out of it no matter what it is. And it's like just the way he talks about having worked at Sears and how it was nasty work. It's like that's really all there is to the line, and like that's you just remember that shit, and that's what he's so great with. And we've also got Trey Wilson, who you probably remember from he was at Arizona and Raising Arizona. And he's got some really great scenes here also. There's the shower one, and then there's the great thing I always liked where he's kind of got the whole way he manages everything and he deals with everything, where it's when he's letting that player go early in the movie, and he says, like, you know, this is the worst part of my job, or something like that. And then when he's getting ready to do that to Crash at the end, he says the exact same line, almost like it's just like a routine for him, when he has to make decisions like that. So that he was a really great casting choice for that. So, yeah, so, you know, as far as that goes, everything else goes, yeah, so like I said, really after a while, the main star of the movie is the sexual tension between Costner and Sarandon, which is really interesting since it was Tim Robbins and Sarandon that got together in real life and stayed together for a very, very long time, because of this movie, when it's really her and Costner that are kind of the stars of it and what's going on between them. How it's basically a plot point, for Nuke at one point, the way they're able to use, you know, sex in the movie, where it's the whole, once he starts abstaining from it, it starts to cause problems between the two of them, and it's like the way he's using it to hopefully keep the streak going, and then all of that. And then by the time it gets to the end, just when we think we really know Sarandon's character after all this other stuff has gone on, there's just this really interesting vulnerability to her that we kind of see it pretty much at the very last minute, like right before the movie ends. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like it's, for lack of a better term, out of left field, because the character's just kind of already had so many like layers at this point, and we already get a sense that there's so much more to her, and the methods in which she does things, and how she has almost like this code of honor about doing it. How saying, like, she may be seen as like this tramp that gets around, but I mean, like, every season she's monogamous, so what can you really say? But then that moment where she just really sort of breaks down, and we kind of see just how we really get to see a human side of her that we didn't quite, it's a different human side that we didn't quite see throughout the whole movie, but it makes perfect sense when we get to that point. And then to the relationship between the two of them that the movie pretty much just kind of leaves us on. So yeah, so that's pretty much what you can really say about that. And like I said, it's a movie that I certainly didn't appreciate at the time because I was so young. But like I said, it really is one of those movies where, and that is a case where it's like, we do seem to be getting long past a point where it's like, you have to be like a certain age to appreciate something or something like that. But this is one of those movies where I feel like there are certain things about it that you kind of have to go into it with if you're going to get the full experience from it. So yeah, and you can probably go in and like, you know, certain aspects of it, but then others might just kind of go past you. But to get the full thing, there is kind of a lot that goes into it, which, like I said, on the surface seems like it wouldn't be that way, where it just looks like on the surface it's just some baseball comedy that just happens to have, you know, like a dirty quality to it. But yeah, so it's got a lot going on, and I'm really glad that I've been able to kind of come back and revisit it over time and kind of see it for what it is, and not necessarily how basically overrated I assumed that it was when I was younger. So yeah, I was glad I was able to move on from that. So we're going to stick with Costner and baseball, but like I said, go in pretty much a totally different tone. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the fact of him being in this, because I had heard that I can't remember if it was the producers or Phil Alden Robinson, who's the director of the movie, the very underrated director of the movie, like really wanted Costner right away. Like he was the first choice. But the issue was nobody wanted to approach him. They were basically too afraid to approach him because it was like he just did Bull Durham. He's not going to want to do this. And apparently he took to it pretty quickly. And it didn't matter to him that he had literally just done a baseball movie the year before. This was also the year right after 8 Men Out had come out. So it was like all these things we had gotten in '88 were coming together in Field of Dreams. So it's interesting just how damn unique of a movie Field of Dreams is when you take all that into consideration. And I think that's how it ended up at the status that it did and how it managed to get made when it did, when it looked like everything was kind of against it because a lot of it had already been explored in just the year before. But the people involved knew there was something totally different on their hands here, I think. And as I mentioned in a couple of videos before, I was able to see this in the theater a few weeks ago, so that was a really enriching experience also. It was one of those cases where, once again, not to take like the whole old man approach, but I do think it's worth acknowledging. There were quite a few people in there, and the people in front of me, like right down here in the row in front of me, were a mom and her 2 kids, and these kids were probably like 8 or 10 or something. And it was just really kind of refreshing to see that the kids were never like, I never saw a phone, and they never seemed disinterested the whole time. And the fact that the movie can still carry on for audiences like that and like new generations, I think it's a really big deal. But at the same time, kind of not surprising at all because the movie just has that magic in it that is it just really feels like a timeless movie the way it approaches its material, especially. Because you start off and you have one of the most famous lines in movie history, also one of the most misquoted. I'm not sure if Jim Carrey and the Cable Guy had anything to do with the massive misquoting, but the "If you build it, he will come" voice. A lot of people say them, but it's he. And the interesting thing about this is the mystery itself surrounding this voice. Because in the credits, if you watch it, the voice has a credit and it says himself. And there's been like a bunch of theories as to who the voice actually is. Some people think it's Costner. Some people, for a while, I was one of the people that thought it was Ray Liotta. But apparently the rumor started getting out that it's Ed Harris, which is interesting because the only connection he has to this movie is he's married to Amy Madigan, who plays Ray's wife. But I can kind of hear it. And he has been known to kind of come on movies and just do like random voice work, like Gravity, when he was Mission Control for like 10 seconds and it was just his voice. So it's like, it is believable. But it's interesting that they kind of have left that mystery up. Like, I don't think there's still a particular confirmation on that or not. Or I just haven't looked into it enough. But I do like that that's just kind of something, and that could just be, like, that's something that doesn't even need to be, kept a mystery. But I just like that they do that anyway because it just adds a whole other kind of feel to the movie when you're watching it. But then, as it goes on, what I really appreciate about this movie is just its absolute refusal to explain itself. And it doesn't even feel like that's the thing too, is it's not explaining itself, but it doesn't feel like it's like making it a mission to do that. It's just like, it just is. The concept itself is just something you have to run with. And it trusts its audience to do that and kind of just be swept up in the magic the way the characters are. And I really love Costner in this. This is one of my absolute favorite Costner performances because of the way he reacts to this stuff, which is to barely react at all. And it's like, there's something so, the way he doesn't, like, have these sort of over-the-top reactions and, like, is, like, constantly questioning what's happening, like, am I really seeing this? The fact that he's so calm about it and, like, welcoming to it almost makes it feel more real, interestingly enough. Like, when he watches them go into the cornfield and we watch them vanish into thin air, and he just laughs to himself and says, that's really cool. Like, that is so cool. And that's all he has to say about it. And after he first realizes what's going on with Shoeless Joe and all that, and discovering what's happening here about them coming back, his response is just, this is really interesting. That's actually his response to her brother not being able to see them. And, like, that's just his response is, this is really interesting. There's no over-the-top way about it, and you just kind of have to run with it. And I also like the fact of the way they handle that in regards to who sees them and who doesn't. And how it's her family that, doesn't feel that magic, so they don't really see them. But the fact that his wife and daughter see them immediately. His daughter sees them before anybody else. She's the one that sees Shoeless Joe for the first time. And then his wife sees them immediately. And the fact that they kind of have, like, the fact that it's such a loving marriage between the two of them that it's almost like a shared dream of theirs, because there's no period where it's only him. Like, she can't hear the voice, but she does see the players, so there is something there, and she has the same dream as him before he leaves. So I think that's just a really beautiful way to portray their family also, where they all kind of have the same experience here. Where half the movie in another movie could have been him trying to convince his family, which just would have been boring. But it just really adds a whole other magical layer to it that they all see it at once. And I also love the fact that they never take the magic away from us, because we always see the characters. Because a thing they could have easily done is the moment when we realize that her brother can't see them. Timothy Busfield can't see them. So, but when he says that, we just go on him saying, what are you talking about? What are you looking at? Because we see the players behind him the whole time. I almost feel like it would have been stripping the magic away from us if we got a cut from his perspective of him saying, what are you talking about? And we see like an empty field behind him. Where it's like, I really feel like that would have just been... Yeah, that just immediately, even if it was just one shot, just one time, it would have really kind of gutted the magic a little bit. And almost would have made them look insane. But the fact that we always see and we're always with them, I think really... That was just definitely the right choice to make, for sure. And then you've got this first scene. One of my favorite scenes maybe ever, when he first meets Shoeless Joe and he goes out there and they just play together. They just hit the balls and throw them back and forth and all that. And it's just this really... I mean, I don't want to get redundant in saying this, given that it's right there in the title, but I mean, just really, yeah, the dreamlike nature of the whole thing. And like I said, the way that Costner just kind of goes with it, where when Amy Madigan looks outside and she knows that is like basically, obviously it's ambiguous if you want to use the word ghost, but like it almost seems too dark for how light the whole thing feels, and how magical it all feels. But the fact that her very first, because we talked about Costner saying this is interesting, this is really cool, her first response to seeing Shoeless Joe back from the dead is, I'll put the coffee on. And it's like just the whole nonchalant approach that the movie takes is what, interestingly enough, really grounds it, what I was saying about Costner's reactions. And so that's, yeah, just like this real asset to the whole movie. And it's like, there's really, you have to do, like, this really is a balancing act. Like, this movie really is kind of, I think I've heard Costner talk about before how risky it felt to make this movie and just tell the audience, not even tell the audience, just after a while they realize, oh, we just have to go with this because that's all there is to it. And I've heard a lot of comparisons with this movie to Cabra's movies, which makes perfect sense. And the fact that you can very easily see like Jimmy Stewart playing Ray. And that really just kind of takes us back to like this kind of... there's something very old-fashioned about it. And I think that whole old-fashioned feel in general about like just portraying movie magic. There's also what I was talking about, that like the nostalgia thing that you get, just the nostalgic feeling that baseball gives you in general when you watch something like Bull Durham. It's sort of like that same feeling with baseball in general, the way this movie sets up, like how baseball has always been in his life and how it was another thing where it was like this whole, it was practically like a religion. And yeah, it just really tells all this stuff beautifully without having to be, you know, overcomplicated about itself. Like, the most, you know, complicated it gets is the whole thing of whether or not they have to sell the farm, which honestly is a pretty logical story point to go, since so much of it is taken up by the field and they have to, like, sacrifice that. So it's like, even within the, like, they find a way to balance the magic with the logic, but that's the great thing, is that they don't really acknowledge that you have to abandon logic for the magic. It's just there. And like I said, to be able to just sort of run with that and not worry about it is, yeah, like I said, it's another case like Bull Durham with the way it handled its content. Was I was saying, like, it'd be nice if movies kind of handled this stuff more. Like, everybody nowadays like needs an explanation for everything. And it's like you go on and you see like if a movie like Field of Dreams, like say Field of Dreams didn't exist until today, and the movie was put out in theaters as is today, and you would have like analysis videos everywhere and everybody on YouTube saying they have the ultimate explanation and all that. And it's like the whole point is it just is. There doesn't have to be some big, explanation or some big meaning. It's just so they can play baseball again. That's all it is. That's all the whole thing is. That's the whole side plot with Doc Graham. Is you go back, you find him in another time, and then he's suddenly Frank Whaley, and then he's young, and we realize who he is, and we got his whole backstory, so we know why he needs to get to the field to also be like the other players and just play one more time, because he barely got the chance to at all, and that one last time is going to make all the difference. And like this whole story of discovering the dream and being able to live it and redemption and all that stuff. That's all it is. There is no other explanation needed. And the whole thing also about when he goes back to 1972 and runs into Doc Graham when he's Burt Lancaster, the way they sort of, like I said, the nonchalance of the magic. Because I remember the first few times I saw it, I always thought there could have been maybe a bit more of a progression to show that he had basically traveled through time, or traveled back in time to 1972. I like they used the Godfather marquee to show that too. But the thing here is that that's also kind of like I said, that's just kind of the matter-of-fact way the magic is here, where the scene just cuts to Ray, and Ray looks like he's just left the motel room and he's just walking around, and it's just like, we don't need to see anything particularly, there doesn't need to be like some grand production. He's just walking, and then suddenly he just is in 1972. That's what the magic is. It's just there. It just lays itself out. And like I said, that's all it needs to do. So, yes. And then going on that also, we have all these different characters we can love. I really love Gabby Hoffman as the daughter. There's James Earl Jones is fantastic. Apparently, the thing that really sold... because I guess he's not a baseball fan at all, but the thing that really sold him on the movie was the "people will come" speech. And scenes like that just really kind of, like put the bow on top of the magic in this movie. Like that's the closest we get to like an explanation. But it's still just kind of the ambiguity of the magic is the magic, the end. So I really love those moments. And then, like I said, Burt Lancaster, I believe, being his last movie, just feels like magical and movie magic in general, to have him with, like, because Costner was just breaking out into, like, the really big thing that he is in movie history and at the time, and then to see him with, like, Burt Lancaster in his last role and this kind of meshing of the generations. Just really, the meshing of the generations also is, like, this big sort of thing you could see in the movie itself with, like, his relationship with his dad and all that, and then the big ending. Or, like, the actor playing his dad also really makes a big impression, just showing up at the very end, with the way they explain how he's, so clueless to what lies ahead of him at the time, when Costner only knew him for being old. It's like, there's something so beautiful about that whole scene. The catch scene, the line of cards, that whole last, I don't even know, like, it's a long scene, too. Like, everything from them getting back to the house, and dropping Archie off, I think, is, like, the whole thing goes to the end. It's just one long scene that's, like, 25 minutes long is the ending of this movie. And it's just, like, magical scene after magical scene of Doc going back and realizing he was always destined to be the Doctor, but still got to play one more time, all that stuff. Timothy Busfield finally being able to see the players. James Earl Jones being taken out into the field, getting to see what's on the other side. And Ray's character kind of taking a turn where it's like for the first time ever we see him get a little selfish, but even then, it doesn't feel like the selfishness is sincere. When he says, I've never asked what's in it for me, and then he's like, well, what do you want to know? And he says, what's in it for me? But when he says, what's in it for me, there's not like it feels kind of forced. Like he's still not like a selfish person in any way, even if he does feel like he's earned the right to know what is over there. And the compromise that he gets, that James Earl Jones goes, and he will eventually find out, because the whole mystery throughout is, why is James Earl Jones here? And it's like the only person we don't think has a purpose here now is me, is what he says. And then it's to not only for him to see what's on the other side, but it's going to get him back to writing after all these years, and God knows, what it is he's going to write about that experience. And it just all comes around in this really beautiful way. And like I said, the relationship between his wife is amazing, and the way they have that, like the whole, and the way she also kind of gets to be her own character, and like the scene where they're talking about the book burning almost seems like, I mean, obviously it introduces Terrence Mann into the movie, but at the same time it almost feels like when it's happening for a while, you're like, what is this scene even doing here? But then it all once again comes together and makes perfect sense. Like, it's a great scene for Amy Madigan, who is just invaluable throughout this movie. And also just kind of those real touches. Like, I was reading somewhere, apparently, that Doc Graham was a real person, and the scene in the movie where James Earl Jones is interviewing people about him and they're talking about him are people that actually, like, knew of him or knew him, or are actually talking about him and their real experiences. So that adds a whole other layer to it also. So, yeah, so obviously this is just this absolutely timeless movie that it gets better every time I see it. Like I said, I'm really grateful I got to see it in a theater a few weeks ago, which was amazing. So, and definitely up there with the... We kind of talked about this when we were talking about... I was reading one of the comments on the Tombstone versus Wyatt Earp video, in that comments video, and we were talking about how Costner, despite, Costner's place in movie history, there's still something kind of underrated about him. Where it's like people nowadays don't really quite remember just how much of an impact he's had and his movies have had. And it's really... This movie is definitely up there with, like, one of his real crowning achievements. Like I said, one of my personal favorites of his performances. So, and like I said, it's just so simple, and that's really what the key to it is, the key to its success. So, yeah, I cannot say enough great things about this. So, now we'll go on to a movie that maybe has a bit less of a reputation than these two. So 10 years after Field of Dreams, Costner decided to make For Love of the Game and revisit the whole love of baseball thing that he had conjured between these two, and the question is the magic still there or not? The cover, which seems to desperately have just been hoping his comment would make the cover of the DVD, is, if you loved Field of Dreams, don't miss For Love of the Game. That's a weird thing to say, because I think, interestingly enough, the movie is much more comparable to Bull Durham. But, whatever. It's like I said, I think that's one of those quotes where it's just like, just saying something like that will probably get you on the cover, because Field of Dreams was a much more sort of beloved, like, mainstream, movie, in regards to, like, emotionally. So, with this, we have basically a regular 90s romance movie that just happens to also be a Kevin Costner baseball movie, which could potentially give it enough prestige to get by if you're, piggybacking on the success of Field of Dreams and Bull Durham. Success being a reference to their quality. Well, the interesting thing about For Love of the Game, probably the most interesting thing about For Love of the Game, is, yeah, it's basically a standard 90s romance movie that's directed by Sam Raimi, who is like this, endless pit of creativity, and can sometimes do something, like, really out of left field, like A Simple Plan. And this was his follow-up to A Simple Plan. And it was just a few years before his Spider-Man took off. So I still to this day have no idea how Raimi ended up directing this, but there it is. It was also the first time he had worked, well, pre-Spider-Man, he'd worked with J.K. Simmons, so there is that connection as well. So the first thing I guess I want to say is, the first thing, interesting enough, because I talked about how I guess you could say it's more comparable to Bull Durham than it is Field of Dreams, is Flow of the Game is like the opposite of Bull Durham for me. When I was talking about how when I first saw Bull Durham, it kind of went over me a little bit, and then I'm able to kind of appreciate it with age. I remembered really liking For Love of the Game the first time I saw it, which probably would have been around the time I was as young as I was when I saw Bull Durham, so pretty young. So if I was 9 when it came out, I was probably like maybe 12 or 13 or something when I saw it, or less than that. But I remember really, really liking it, and I can kind of somewhat remember why when I watch it now, but I can easily say I don't like it to the extent I did at one time, especially as it ages. So it's one of those movies that starts off with everything going south for him just immediately at the very start. His team is getting sold, he's getting traded, and Kelly Preston is leading him. Which is kind of the first thing here that you notice is when you think of it just being a regular, everyday love story, while simultaneously trying to be a sports movie, is the interesting premise of the love story pretty much already having happened. And it's just a matter of how we got to this point, so we go back. So there is something there that you could work with. But how this movie handles it, I don't know. Because it pretty much immediately goes into the flashbacks where he first met her, and then we keep cutting back and forth throughout the movie, which is pretty jarring when it happens. And there's even some cases where, if you're not like invested in the movie enough, you'll sometimes forget exactly where you are in time. Where like it'll just randomly cut to like Costner sitting somewhere, and you're like, oh wait a minute, is this after the game we've been at, or if this is before you realize that the game goes all the way to the end? Yeah, so that can get really jumbled in that way. But then there's also the way that we see him, and there's something here to Costner's performance when we get like the first flashback where he gets to play with the whole. At the start, obviously, all this stuff has happened, and he's like really jaded. He's like really worn down. But then when we see him in the first flashback 5 years earlier, before all this shit's gone down, and he's scorned by all this, he seems more like unseasoned and more lively. So there is something to that, and the fact that we're going to kind of get to watch the sort of deterioration that happens. But once again, I don't know that they do everything that they can to make this worthwhile, because the movie is almost 2 hours and 20 minutes. And that's pretty long for a movie like this, especially one that's constantly bouncing around. But there are certain things here that stand out, like some of the visual tricks, like when, like the baseball scenes are really, really well shot. I think that's one thing that was like really appealing to me at the time I first saw it. But then also the way he like has that ability to like block out the crowd and all that, and that he has like that first time up when I think it's Tuttle that's up the bat, and he's having like that monologue with himself, where he's having like a full-on conversation with himself. But it's not an internalized Crash Davis monologue. It's speaking out loud to myself like an insane person, Nuke LaLoosh monologue. So there's a lot of things where you can see in this movie, like just in general, the opposite of Bull Durham. There's the whole thing also where it's his motto is think, don't just throw, whereas the whole thing in Bull Durham is just throw it, don't think about it. When you think about it, that's when you fuck up. So it's like it's intentionally, like I said, it's almost like it's trying to be some sort of companion piece, but it's also kind of having the same effect in regards to being the opposite of everything Bull Durham was, in the negative sense. So even though he does eventually get back to the whole just throw, don't think thing, it takes a very long time to get there, and for him to come to that conclusion. And it does seem like they have enough they set up here that they want to play with, like his relationship with the other players. Like his whole thing with Birch, I think is the guy's name, is something that feels like it's supposed to be a lot more fleshed out than it is, and it's something I probably would have liked to have seen. You could cut out, like, I mean, I know it's trying to be the love story first and foremost, but I mean, if you cut out like half of the Kelly Preston scenes and made it like and throw in like his relationships with some of the other players, oftentimes the opposing players, I think you might have a much more interesting movie here. But the love story is the first and foremost. The word love is in the title, so you can tell. And they aren't just talking about, you know, the game, as it were. You can get a much more sense of a love for baseball in movies like Bull Durham and Field of Dreams, for sure. This one is kind of solely about the, hey, I'm in this really shitty relationship, but we're trying to make it look as romantic as possible. This relationship, like, really feels kind of toxic. There's so many things that are constantly wrong with this relationship that kind of really sucks the romance out of it when you're watching it again. Like I said, I still try to find that connection I found with it the first time I saw it, and I'm still trying to remember what exactly I was that made me like it as much as I did. And I'm wondering if maybe it was, because one of the problems I have now, obviously, is the length. It's way too fucking long, but I do kind of have this distant memory, I think, of liking it for almost feeling like it had sort of an epic feel. Where it kind of did feel like pretty character-driven. How you feel about the characters themselves is another story, but as far as it trying to drive the story with solely the characters, where we have like this whole sort of intermission where they just kind of go off together, so there is something there, and then the whole thing where he like almost cuts his thumb off or whatever the hell he does with a saw, because of course, you know, fuck around a saw is exactly what you want to do in the situation that you're in right now, and comes back to bite him for this big game it keeps cutting back to. But I think one of the things that would maybe help this is if it was more well written. The dialogue in this is all over the damn place. Every now and then we do have kind of a nice moment, like a likable moment between them, like when they're talking on the phone and she's trying to get him to say like how much he cares about her. So she's saying like, you know, if I was this, you know, exaggerated scenario, would you still love me and stuff like that. And it gets to the point where she says, like, you know, if I was, like all my features were scraped off me and I was just nothing more than, like, a torso with no face, would you still love me? He has this really charming response of, no, but we could still be friends. Which is really nice. But a lot of the dialogue is not like that, and it's not that charming. Their dialogue is, like, sometimes there's stuff that feels nonsensical. Like, when he and John C. Reilly are talking, and he starts doing the use the loofah thing, I feel like that's a reference to something, but it comes from out of nowhere, and is never explained, and really has no place in this scene. Maybe it's to show the friendship between them, like, it almost feels like maybe an in-joke between them, but John C. Reilly seems just as lost as we are in this moment, so, okay. There's the thing when she calls him up to say Jenna Malone is missing in the city, and he needs to go look for her, and he's like, what's her name? And she says it's Freedom, and then there's a pause, and she says, I'm kidding, I scared you, didn't I? It's actually Heather. Alright, whatever. And then there's stuff like, when they go to the hospital after he's cut himself, and she's desperately trying to get him help, but nobody's helping him. So she's basically playing the, do you know who he is card, do you not realize who he is? But the way she says this is she screams, is this not America? I guess because baseball is America's game and he's a famous player. It's fucking weird. A lot of the dialogue in this is really weird. And just gives the whole movie this weird off feel. So that's not helping anything. And then sometimes you look at the, some of the stuff, like the behind-the-scenes stuff. One particular thing that stands out, that once again is just kind of a weird story about this movie, is supposedly, this is just what I read, that does not mean that it's true, but supposedly, from what I've read, there was a deleted scene of Costner doing full frontal nudity. And apparently, the test audiences, when they saw his dick, could not help but laugh. And apparently Costner was absolutely adamant about that scene being in the movie. And I guess the test audiences, the producer or something, said something on the lines of, we can get the points of this movie across without anybody having to see Kevin Costner's dick. So I don't know what that was about. Especially since this movie is PG-13 as is. It's like, it almost would have been like the string of fuck scene in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, where it's like, you've got like a PG movie, and then just one scene from out of nowhere that makes it R-rated, is what that probably would have been. And yeah, so, and I would say, it sounds humiliating on Costner's end to say he showed his dick and audience members laughed. I would say that's probably more of a discomfort thing, and like I said, given the tone of the movie, it probably came from out of nowhere, and that's probably why it got that reaction. So, yeah. So that's just something I keep hearing about this movie. But you take all of that out of it, and you look at just the love story, which is supposedly what's driving the whole thing. Like I said, this relationship is terrible pretty much from the start. Like, it's sort of, like, it fades fast, like, there's barely, like, a honeymoon period for them. There's the whole thing where she comes to his house and that other girl is, like, scantily clad there. There's when she goes to the hospital with him and she's just getting rejected left and right by everybody, including him. And the fact that Costner's character has this penchant for, like, just throwing tantrums throughout it, and it's like this dude isn't suited for like a committed relationship like this. So it's like when they get together at the end, there's been so much of this. Like, because you look at romance movies and there's always going to be the downer time where, like, the conflict has happened, they go their separate ways, and everyone sulks until they decide to get back together. But the downer portion of this movie is like a whole fraction of it. It's like a whole part of, like, the movie, and not just like this moment where we're waiting for the conflict to be resolved. So it's like, by the time they get together at the end, it's like, where the hell is this relationship gonna go? Like, yeah, you know, he doesn't have the pressure of baseball now. He does have that really nice scene where the game is over, and it's ended as well as it can. He was sent off with a bang, so he's just kind of sitting alone in his room and crying. Is pretty beautiful, and a beautiful moment for Costner. But then once again, you back it up with this whole, hey, you know, we can work this out. And it's like, I don't know, can you? Because I don't know that, yeah, you take some of the conflict out, but I mean, it still feels like there's enough character flaws here to where, I don't know, it doesn't feel like the big, happy 90s romantic movie ending it's supposed to feel like. So, I don't know. It probably would have worked a lot better also if we had more of the baseball scenes, because the baseball scenes are really well done. They are. Even if the monologue scenes feel a bit Bull Durham light, they're still pretty good. So, and like I said, his relationship with the other players, John C. Reilly in particular, that's another scene that makes it feel like it's so damn long, is the scene where John C. Reilly gets his big inspirational speech. The whole thing where he talks about, you know, just throw. Like, don't even think, just throw it. When it brings Bull Durham back and he takes his own advice, feels very climatic, very inspirational. And it's a big, big moment in the movie. And then you hit the clock, and there's still 40 minutes left. There's still 40 minutes left when it feels like the movie's reached its inspirational peak. And it feels climatic. So you can see where it kind of goes downhill. So, yeah, like I said, I would like to rediscover what I liked about it the first time I saw it, but as is, especially when you compare it to these others, not his best foray into baseball, but it was nice that he had the passion enough to go another round, more or less. To go into an extra inning, if you will, since it was 10 years later, we'll say. So, these three together, I would say certainly The Field of Dreams is my favorite one. But like I said, Bull Durham is really aging well, and For Love of the Game, not so much. So I think that's where we're left with this. So next time, I think we're just going to go simple. I think I'm going to talk about a couple of action movies that have probably been forgotten, but and then we'll go into, I'm not sure what I'll do the weekend of the Lion King. I think for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I'm going to do what somebody suggested in one of the comments, which was True Romance and Natural Born Killers. So we'll very much look forward to that. So until all that other stuff, I think we're done here.